Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to spend an hour, as AJ mentioned, on the residential code significant changes and just sort of talk about what is significant, what is not really very significant in this particular cycle. We are getting fewer and fewer significant changes every cycle. And at this point, they are primarily in the electrical requirements, which become from the National Electric Code. And so I won't talk about those today. And then also from our energy code. And I will talk about the changes in the energy code. So those are the two primary areas. There is very little in the life safety realm. There's very little on fire in the IRC. And they are semi-significant changes where they pop up for townhouses and two-family dwellings. We'll look at those. But compared to cycles previously, these are very, very few truly significant changes. We have changes. They're just minor tweaks for the most part. So yes, this class is by ICC, or the International Code Council. And what we'll cover today is really looking at what has happened between the 2021 and the 2024 IRC. I will cover a few things out of chapter 3, which is the life and fire safety foundations. We're pretty much going to skip because there was nothing that was truly significant for an hour's worth of content. Chapters 5 and 6 are floors and walls. We have a couple changes from each of those. And then wall finishes, there are a couple changes there. Primarily, I will focus on changes in energy because that's where the biggest changes were. And then the appendices add some new options for an existing home that are not a two-family dwelling or a townhouse. And our accessory dwelling units are just a little weird. So we'll talk about that and what can come up that you will probably strike you as odd. And it is, but it's what we've got right now. And then extended framing is another new appendix I'll briefly talk about. So that's kind of it, just things that have changed what we were doing in the past a bit. Number one change, as soon as you open one of the 2024 codes, you're going to find that they are not two columns like the old codes are. They are rather a single column of text. And the tables and figures will be very closely associated with the text that was there before. So that's a new and weird change. There is that QR code symbol in the figure or in the code text. That just means that there are changes within a large section. So the changes could be in the subsection or the main part. You can click the QR code in a digital document, go to it. If you have a paper code, then you can go to ICC's website, click on codes, and then just go, like in this case, to the 2024 IRC. And in blue text, it will show you what changed. So most of the code text is black, and then where it changed for 2024 will be blue. So that's probably the easiest way at this point if you have a paper code to do and just kind of skip the QR codes, but they're there as well. As far as our black bars that were the margin markings before, they are not in the 2024. They may end up being in the 2027. That hasn't been decided yet. The design requirements, that's chapter 3. That's a really big chapter. And we had a group this time that wanted to rearrange it because we've had enough new sections come in that they felt like it was confusing trying to find things, especially for somebody who was new to the codes. And section 301, 302, the first two are where they were before, and everything after them has rearranged its order to try to group things that are similar together, as we'll see here shortly. That's the main change in this chapter. So what we see now are the first block being primarily structural and passive fire resistance topics, the next block of active fire resistance. Then you get to things like minimum room size, minimum ceiling heights, then egress, then our weird accessibility and elevators, then things like lighting and openable windows and safety glazing. And then lastly, as a group, I call energy, but they are things like photovoltaic panels, generators, safe space around the stationary batteries that are going into garages so that people who have solar panels can charge those batteries rather than just selling the power back on to the grid. So those are the things that are currently in chapter 3 and the general organization. A little more detail about that. The location that you got, what the wind speed is for the local area, the snow, other criteria that were structural criteria or energy, it was in section 301, still in section 301. And then the information for townhouses and two-family dwellings that was in section 302 about fire resistant ready construction, it's still in the same location. After that, everything changes. So you'll see from the list, it's kind of structural-ish topics other than the foam plastic that's related to the fire resistant construction. And then they go to the fire topics. And then, as I mentioned before, our minimum room size, minimum height. There's also sleeping lofts in this new section that are brand new, and they are smaller than a habitable attic, and they're there primarily for something like a tiny home where you have a loft within a single room space. And then most of our attic spaces are habitable attics, not a loft. And then there's mezzanines also that are that open stairway space. So as you go from the first level up to the second level in some of our single family homes, there'll be a space where a wall hasn't been built, but there's just guardrails at the edge of the stairs and kind of sort of a hallway area. Those are what the IRC is calling a mezzanine. And actually the biggest change in the IRC for the structural portion is for the floors at those mezzanines that we'll see in a bit. Next section is our means of egress. So stairs, ramps, guardrails, front door, other doors, emergency escape and rescue windows, and then the fall protection are all in that means of egress section. Accessibility has been in the code, but it only triggers for townhouses. So it's there, but almost nobody ever looks at it, even when they're doing townhouses. Elevators, platform lifts. And then we get to what I mentioned before was the glazing and hazardous locations, content. And lastly, our new energy section, which most of those are actually brand new to this code. We already had solar panels, but not much else in the IRC previously. All right, so that's reorganization of the chapter. If we look at what was significant as in terms of changes within chapter 3, the snow load map, I'm going to say for most of the country is not a significant change. If you look at what is in front of you right now with that kind of orangish brown, 2 different shades, one lighter, one darker of color, that's where the snow load is less than 20 pounds per square foot. 20 pounds per square foot is also what we set the roof live load at. So anywhere that it's 20 or less, we just use the roof live load, and we don't really care even. So mid-range orange color and darker orangish brown color, those 2 areas of the country are controlled by the roof live load. And that's where people are doing maintenance on the roof, bringing up asphalt shingles briefly, moving around on the roof. We just build all of our roofs to resist that load. And if your snow load is less than that, then you don't worry about it. If your rain load is less than that, you don't worry about it. As we go farther north in the maps, you'll see over the Rocky Mountains and basically in the west, a lot of dark purple color, and those are our highest snow loads in the mountains. If you look in Maine, northern Vermont, and New Hampshire area and northern New York, those areas are the lake effect snows where we get a very deep snow during the winter, and those areas also are some of our highest snow loads in the country. Traditionally, Maine has been an 80-pound per square foot and 90-pound per square foot snow load. That may end up changing with some of the changes, as we're going to see here shortly. But that's kind of it. Going from the south, we have no snow or a brief snow that melts right away. And so it's 5 pounds or less on the roofs. And then that transitions as we head northward to more and more snow. Northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, they get a lot of snow some winters, other winters not as much. And so you'll see they're into the purplish colors, but they're not as dark as the peaks of the Rockies and the Cascades, or even northern Maine. All right, the next map just shows us how things changed. When you look at this map, if the colors are orange, that means the snow load in that location decreased. So if you look at a state like Minnesota, where they currently have if I remember this right, it's either 40 and 50 or 50 and 60 pounds snow load in the state, it actually has the opportunity to drop now, because what was found is that the snow loads that they're getting there are less than they were in the past. Other areas are that dark bluish purple color. And where it's darkest, those are the areas that have the biggest change in snow load. Some of those are in the area where the snow loads are less than 20 pounds per square foot, so there won't be a change for them. They'll still be controlled by the roof live load, no big deal. But one of the locations in the country we've noticed has a significant change, and the snow load is high enough that it makes a difference, is in the Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia area. That particular area had a big increase of snow. In the West, there are some mountainous regions where what used to be the snow load and what it is now changed because of the way the maps get smoothed. That elevation changes really quickly, and when they tried to make a map of the country, it got weird. So I'm expecting those numbers to maybe change before the next cycle of the standard that does these maps is out. We'll see. Bottom line, if you're in the southern third of the country, you don't worry about this, whether or not there was a change. If you're in the middle and north and the numbers went down, then you don't worry about it. It'll only be where the numbers increase. So think again, the Washington, D.C. area, some of the mountains out in the west will be the areas that are most affected. How do you figure out what these snow loads are? So the building departments are going to use ASCE's tool. Before, they could look at the IRC and figure it out, and now the map is so detailed they can't really see it easily. So they'll go use this tool. I put some boxes around some things that show up here. One of the items you'll see is, it says standard version and then ASCE/SEI 722. That's the most recent standard that they've published, and it goes with the 2024 IRC. So that's what comes up first on the tool. It's already selected for you. The next thing's that risk category. Most buildings in the country, that's commercial and residential, are risk category 2. Everything in the IRC is risk category 2. So that gets selected. And then you can click snow. And that's the information that you need. You click the view results, and you get this second thing that pops up. So if you look at, in this case, it was Reno, Nevada, the snow load listed is 44 pounds per cubic foot. Square foot. That number is going to look really high compared to what Reno had previously. So there's a weird twist to this, that when you're looking at a single family home, a 2-family home, or townhouses, you get to take a deeper dive into the information. And what happens is you either click the details, the full report, or the summary buttons there. Details gives you the shortest, smallest amount of information. It's nicest. So we'll take a look at that. And way down at the bottom of that page, it tells you that the ground snow load for the IRC is 30.8 or 31 pounds per square foot. So that's not the same as what the tool initially tells you. And that's because the number it gives you is for engineers to do commercial buildings. And then in order to find the number that we use for the IRC, it is buried in the details. The group ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers, they make these tools and they say that they are going to update them for us so that there's an easier to find number for the IRC. We'll see what that looks like, how that happens with time. Hopefully, we'll cross our fingers. Hopefully this will happen. As far as going online and looking for the tool, you can always Google it, but the name just changed and it's now literally ASCE hazardtool.org. So you can just put that in, go straight to the website. If you ever saw their older website, that web address still works. If you used in the past the Applied Technology Council's wind speed tool or hazard tool, those now point you directly to this new updated tool as well. So every old route that you had to go get things like the wind speed or snow load, they will get you to this new updated tool and the tables that I'm showing you today. All right, so that was the biggest thing in section 301, really the only big thing that was occurring in section 301. And again, most of the country, it's not a big deal. It's no deal, but there are some small areas where it's going to be a big deal. The next section is about townhouses and two-family dwellings. And we had some groups just trying to clarify what to do when people stagger a townhouse. So one unit is in front of the next unit, or when they build a deck that sticks out from those units. And the first change they did was just looking at exterior walls and saying, all right, how do we define the difference between the party wall of a townhouse and any walls that may extend forwards or backwards as part of that party wall, but they're only on one unit, they're not on the other unit. What do we call them? How do we address them? And what sort of protection should they have? Across the country, different building departments do different things. Right now, they are some of them require a 2-hour wall on that extension of the wall. Some require a 1-hour wall. Some say, well, the code doesn't say, and so we can't require anything. So this new requirement says basically there's an imaginary lot line between those two townhouses. It runs across the party wall. And if one townhouse wall extends beyond the other one, then that wall extension is on the imaginary lot line. Because it's on a lot line, that requires a 1-hour wall protection and no windows, or windows that are rated for fire resistance on that line, which in some jurisdictions means that we'll have a reduction of the wall fire resistance that's required. Some will require a 1-hour wall where they didn't before, and some already required a 1-hour wall. So depending upon where you are, this may change construction, or it may be exactly what construction was like already. In the past, here's an example of townhouses that have a balcony. You'll see that each one is separated from the next, and they're basically separated by a minimum of 10 feet. That was one jurisdiction's way to deal with the fact that we want separation between these townhouses. The balconies are unprotected, and they wanted a way, if somebody had a fire on one balcony, that it wouldn't spread to the next balcony and into a unit that way, that it would still have to go through that party wall. So they separated by 10 feet. Now, if that balcony is on the lot line, then it needs to be protected the way some jurisdictions are interpreting it. The way other jurisdictions are interpreting it, it's a projection of the building beyond the outer edge of the building, and they may not require protection. So when it comes to a deck or a balcony, this is still not clear. You won't get one answer across the country about what you need to do. But the zero lot line will at least steer people towards a more consistent answer than we've ever had before. Another change that came up in this section is our two-family dwellings. So we have, for many decades, had a typical construction where two-family dwellings were placed next door to one another. And they may have been on the same lot, or they may have had two separate lots, but always there was that 1 hour dividing the two units. In a few areas of the country, there would occasionally be construction where one unit was on top of another unit, so stacked rather than side by side. And that was totally fine. But when you got into a discussion about, okay, what do you do at the floor assembly to protect the unit above from the unit below, it varied as far as interpretation of what you needed to do when. Some areas of the country said we need a 1 hour floor assembly, so you can't run anything through it. No utilities go through there. They got to go up the side of the house. You had other groups say you can run the utilities, but they have to be in their own shaft. And you had a few who said, well, the 1 hour is going to be the protection at the ceiling level, and we won't worry about what goes on above it. And that was a non-standard response, but a few jurisdictions did that. So mostly it was either protect everything in the shaft or run it up the outside of the building. Well, with the 2024 code, we now have an option where you may have a half stacked and half side by side unit. So one might be twice as big as the other unit, and you'll have a portion that's side by side with a 1 hour wall separation and a portion stacked on one another, and the floor will have a 1 hour separation there too. So it's become a little weirder, mostly because of our accessory dwelling units, as we'll see later, but that's out there as an option. A second change with our stacked dwelling units is where we are looking at notifying the unit above that there's a fire going on in the unit below. And so what's basically required here is that there be a smoke alarm wirelessly tied into the smoke alarms for the unit below that's at the unit above. It could be right at the entryway, that will go off when there's a fire and something setting off that smoke alarm in the unit below. So one, allowing the unit above to know there's a fire. And then as far as the stairwell getting down and out of the building goes, we're going to have a smoke separation, allowing that both within our 1 hour assembly for the separation between the two stacked units, and a separation of the stairwell, or here we have the stairwell going outside the building, which brings up a number of interesting questions that aren't answered in the IRC as well. But big deal here is to have a smoke alarm that goes off when the alarms in the lower unit go off. And then a second issue of, besides having that 1 hour protection between the two units, also make sure it's a smoke separation as well. The IRC doesn't tell us what a smoke separation ought to look like. So you'll find the building departments discuss it in terms of what the IBC will require for smoke separation and sealing things, having dampers, but we don't actually have any interconnected mechanical units between them. So dampers just don't come up for the IRC. Our last change in this section is a change for shared accessory rooms. The idea being here that a two-family dwelling might have its two units and then a shared space in between that could be a laundry, could be a storage area. The intent was to just protect people in the units from a potential fire in this shared space. It's not a 1 hour wall like the wall that separates the two units. Rather, it's a protected space that's finished, similar to a garage. So we have gypsum board on all the walls and the ceiling. If there is living space above that ceiling, then it's a type 5X gypsum board. And we have doors that are equivalent to a garage door. leading from this shared space to the two different units, as we'll see here shortly. So it's very similar to construction in a garage. We've got the separation of gypsum board, and I forgot in this particular PowerPoint, I don't have the information on the doors, but the doors are self-closing, self-latching, just as you'd find at the garage. All right, the last portion of chapter 3 is these new energy sections. And the first one is just looking at if I want to store the batteries in a basement or a storeroom, maintenance room that's within the house, what's my minimum protection? And the decision was to make separation of those batteries from the rest of the house equivalent to what you'd have in a garage. So you're going to have the drywall. You're going to be required to add in the heat detector and any ventilation that's pulling air out of this space and into the rest of the house will have a damper that can shut in the event of a fire in this location. And this is being driven by the fact that fires are very hot when lithium batteries burn, and they're very difficult to put out. So we're trying to allow some extra protection of this space between it and the rest of the house where somebody's living, giving them a little more time to get out of that space. The other concern was where you have a garage, that cars not drive in and run into the batteries and start a fire that way. So we have some new requirements that say you're going to protect those batteries from any car potentially running into them. And this actually extends to charging stations too. So if you place a charging station on the exterior of the building, as you see here, then that charging station will have a bollard, as we'll see shortly, in front of it, or curb stop. And then as we look at the interior of the garage, you will see the same thing. There's an option of putting in curb stops. Let me see if I can get my pointer to work here. All right, hopefully you can see where my arrow is pointing at curb stops in the middle of the left car driving path. So an option now is to put curb stops into a garage so that there is 4.5 feet between the curb stop and the battery stack. And that's considered enough protection that as a car drives in, if for whatever reason the car doesn't stop soon enough, it'll hit the curb stop, the tire may go over, but the car will stop. The other option is to install bollards, as you see on the right side driving path, these rectangles with the circle in the center that's shaded in. That's to represent a vertical bollard that's sitting there. You often see them painted yellow, and they stop cars also from continuing on. These are very efficient at stopping any vehicles, and you only need 6 inches of space there. So a comment just came up. Most garages won't have an extra 4.5 feet. That is absolutely correct. And these are only required when somebody's putting battery stacks in their garage. They can put them on the sides, as we see here as well. So the right side of this garage has a return wall at the front end, and so no protection is required of those batteries until you get to the back. The left side doesn't have a return wall, and therefore is going to have bollards protecting the batteries all the way in. So an option for people who want to put the batteries in their garage is to go ahead and protect them with bollards along the sides of the garage and still leave the entire depth open. Another option, of course, is to have a shed somewhere out on the property where the batteries get stored, and then you are going to have to run conduit to it to charge those batteries from the solar panels that are up on the roof. That's the intention here. Let's see, we also had a comment about furnace and lithium battery charge station. Furnace needs a damper to the inside of the home. Yeah, so that, let's see, that was one slide back. But that's the intent, is that, if I can get this to go back, there we go, 2 slides. All right, so in the figure here, there's the image of ventilation. That's trying to get at the idea that we'll need a damper that's a self-closer that will close at the time that the heat detector says there's a fire in this space. So the damper closes and you don't have the fire pulled in through the ductwork into the rest of the house. Again, they're just a higher hazard if you do have a fire. It's nothing saying that you will have a fire, just in the event that there is one. These new code provisions are trying to protect people long enough that they can get out of the house, even if it's the middle of the night and they're sound asleep. That's the intent of all this. Is it a very effective way to deal with the batteries in the garage? No, because we already have a very shallow garage in most garage designs. So putting them in is next to impossible. Just stick him in the back of the garage and then adding another 6 inches before you get to a bollard that needs a very large anchor bolt, as a matter of fact, that needs to go deeper than the typical 3 to 4 inch thick slab that we have across most of the country. All of those are issues with installing this and reasons why people may very well not do it. For those of you who happen to be in Texas, your post-installed or post-tension slabs are going to be thicker, but then you have the issue of trying to put in an anchor where there might be a tendon that's going to burst if it gets drilled into. That's a very large hazard as well. So I don't know that this is going to become common construction. It's just there in the code this time. And it may be tweaked in the 2027 codes. It may remain as is. We shall know in just a few months. All right, and that covers everything for chapter 3, life and fire safety. Now we'll look at chapter 5 because there just wasn't anything significant in chapter 4. So chapter 5, this is going to be the biggest framing change in the entire code. And what it's basically doing is where you have an open stairway where you can look down to the story below, there are guardrails there. And for decades, we've had requirements that those guards have to resist 200 pounds of force as somebody falls into it or is pushed into it or whatever. The guards had to resist that force. The question that came up from the manufacturers of the guards was, can the floor actually resist that load? So their guard is good. It's tested for 200 pounds, but the connection it has to the floor below, unless that floor is beefed up as far as the amount of lumber that's there, their belief is the floor would not be able to resist that 200 pounds of load. So we now are going to have a floor, we'll call it an enhanced edge of the floor at a mezzanine-like area like this that is open by a stairway. And of course, if the builder decides to build a half wall or a full height wall at the stairs, then this all goes away. They don't have to do any of it. But if they choose to have that edge of the floor open and guardrails put there, then they're going to be reinforcing the floor per the IRC, or they can always hire an engineer who can then design that floor or the house or whatever portion they want for the load that's going to be here. So this is a prescriptive solution that is very, very beefy compared to anything we've seen before. So what does it look like? Bottom line is that the rim board that we're used to at the edge of the floor, it's been a 1-ply member, so 1.5 or 2-inch nominal by say 10 if the floor has 10-inch joists. It's now going to be 2 plies. It'll be a 3-inch minimum by, the minimum called out in the code is a 2 by 10, so two 2 by 10s. If the floor is deeper than that, then 2 by 12 going on up. And then first you double the rim board. Then if your guardrail lines up to a joist, you're going to add extra nails from sheathing into that joist and sheathing into the rim board to tie everything together tighter. And that whole reinforcing of the joist will allow the floor edge to resist the load on that guardrail. Sometimes the guardrails are not lined up with the joists, and so there's also an example for when that happens. Say the joist is halfway, or the guardrail is halfway between two joists, then you add blocking where the guardrail is and run it back 16 inches, and then put blocking at that location between the two floor joists. So you're basically tying together two sets of blocking, and it's 2-ply of blocking in each location, as you see in this figure. So again, 2-ply at the rim, 2-ply of blocking leading back from the guard to a horizontal section of 2-ply blocking at that location too. All minimum 2x10 or larger. There's a third option where somebody can skip all the extra blocking and do a 3-ply edge of the floor, basically put a big beam on the floor. And that'll be an option for them as well. Then the final option is where their joists happen to run parallel to the edge of the floor. And so there they'll still have that 2-ply of rim board with blocking at the guardrail leading back to the first joist, and a bunch of nails from the sheathing into all of the blocking and rim board to tie everything tightly together. So that is the intent here, is to just make the edge of that floor very rigid where all the guardrails will be put in. This is not like anything we've ever had prescriptively before in the IRC. So it will be a very big change for builders. All right, that is our largest change in the floors. A minor change in decks in walls is just emphasizing what has been in the code, but people would miss. So builders will occasionally buy like a 45-foot header to go across the front of a 3-car garage. And the intent has always been that every opening has king studs at the end of the header, so that we always block off every opening with king studs and the portal frames that people are doing. And then you make a new portal frame for the next opening. This just reinforces that the header does not extend over multiple openings. It just goes across one opening, across the panels that are there, and stops at a king stud. Then you start the next portal. So it's not really a change. It's just clarifying where people didn't realize they should be looking for a king stud at the end of the header, that yes, they should. The wall finishes section is strongly emphasizing having that water resistive barrier behind the various cladding materials. So in this example here, we're seeing a water resistive barrier, and then the continuous insulation and air gap, and then the brick veneer as the exterior cladding of this particular building. There are multiple options now in the code. So there is an option where people just use the continuous insulation that works as a water resistive barrier if it is taped off and finished. So they have options. And you will probably see people doing different things because there are so many different options right now. But they can use a traditional felt water resistive barrier. They can use the plastics that become so common across the country. They just have to follow manufacturer's installation instructions as they install them and meet those installation instructions. And then there's now this extra option where you can actually use the continuous insulation, but then you still need a gap off your cladding to that insulation. When we look at decks, this section also reinforces the fact for an outdoor deck, you need continuous water resistive barrier both behind the flashing and in front of the flashing right above the deck ledger. And this is being driven by the fact that when a deck fails, nearly always the reason it fails is that the lumber in that deck ledger that connects to the house and the rim board of the floor of the house has rotted away. The ledger frequently is the weakest link. So we are trying to make sure that the water that comes down through the walls moves away from the wall before it gets to the deck ledger and is draining out beyond the ledger onto the deck itself. So that's the intent here. The last change, it comes up in 3 different sections, and it's basically clarifying what we need to do for vinyl siding. So there are now some sketches of what a starter strip is, where it needs to go, what a utility trim is, and where it needs to go. We also have some clearances clarified for vinyl siding, including the 6 inches from the ground, as you see here, and a 1/2 inch from other horizontal segments of the house. So making sure that vinyl siding can also drain down and away from the lumber that's in the house. And the changes here do show up in both the polypropylene and vinyl siding sections. So we have 2 separate sections within the code for the 2 different styles. Both of them will state again and again that you look to see that the siding is installed per the manufacturer's requirements. This is starting to get a little more complicated than it used to be. We have so many different types of water resistant barrier now and siding that some of them, the manufacturer will say, do not use our water resistant barrier with this type of siding. So that the manufacturer is aware of instances where things don't work well together, and they will actually state that in both their requirements and then their installation instructions. All right, moving to energy, where we had the most changes. In the 2021 codes, the energy section was broken into 4 separate paths. That's reinforced here in the 2024. Most of the content you'll see about prescriptive requirements comes out of, or about energy, comes out of the prescriptive compliance path. The simulated building performance and energy rating are both 2 software paths that are common in some areas of the country, and other areas you never see them. And then the tropical climate region option is something that we don't use within the US. We aren't tropical enough. Even if you look at the Florida Keys or Hawaii, they're still in subtropical regions, and it doesn't apply. So a big change with the 2024 is to move back the requirements that we had in the 2021. The 2021 code had made the U factors even harder to meet, had increased the R factors for insulation, and what we see this round is it going backwards for those requirements. The other thing we see is just how you read the tables. The tables were getting very wide and they didn't fit pages well, so they've been reshaped so they now have the list of the various attributes going down the page, and across the page are just our 8 climate zones. Actually 9 if we count zone 0. So what you'll see here, if you've looked at the 2021 energy code, then you will have seen a R49 and R60 requirement for insulation of roofs. That flips back with the 2024 to what we had in the 2018, and you'll now see an R of 38 for zone 2 and up till you get to the R of 49. So it just slides back to the 18 requirements, and they were able to do that because they also looked to see what other alternative options people could do, which allows a builder to say, all right, I usually do this. How many points does it get me? They have to meet a minimum of 10 points in at least 2 different areas with a total of 10. So if they can do these additional trade-offs, then they didn't need the the insulation that was so thick, it was next to impossible to get it into a house without going to continuous insulation on the exterior. So that was the intent here, was to try to trade off things that people typically do for these insulation values that are really difficult to do. They can still do them. They can still have an R49 or an R60 in the house if they've changed their designs to where that works for them nicely. So I think that covers everything I wanted to talk about with the insulation. It rolled back. You will see the numbers having gone down. If you're accustomed to looking at houses that are built to the 18, then you won't see any change there. As far as existing homes go, the intent of the code is to bring some insulation in them if they never had any. So you'll see some requirements shortly for that. Duct leakage. We have this new table trying to make it easier to figure out what duct leakage you should be looking at. So where we have a large house, more than 1,000 square feet of conditioned floor area, it breaks it down in the cubic feet per minute per 1,000 square or 100 square feet, sorry. And that's what you see in the middle of this table is for that bigger floor, a floor of less than 1,000 square feet conditioned space. You're just looking at cubic feet per minute for the duct system leakage. So various depending upon where the system is located, how many ducted returns are in this building, it will cause you to have either a higher value for the amount of total leakage or a lower value. Just big house, small house, where did they put the mechanical equipment? How long does the total duct length end up needing to be to get throughout the house? That was the intent here, was just to limit it. Yes, we're going to have controls on everything. 2021 brought in some lighting controls, made some changes. We'll see shortly. These are exhaust fan controls. So these are ones in the bathroom or toilet room. They are now required to have a sensor tied to them. It can be a timer. It can be an occupancy control. It can be a humidity or contaminant control. So basically the builder has an option of which type of control they put in, but they don't have an option anymore of whether or not they place one in that space. For the lighting, last cycle, we looked at habitable rooms and had requirements to control lighting there as well as outside the building. So things like dawn dusk sensors went outside the building. So at dusk, the security lights would turn on, they'd turn off at daylight. Indoors, they gave options of occupancy controls or a manual dimmer, which I always imagined was a problem for new homeowners, that their lights would turn off in the living room while they were in there and they wouldn't appreciate that. Now, this control of lighting has expanded to places that are not typically occupied. So we have garages, basements, laundry rooms, utility rooms coming into this group where you might have an occupancy sensor and the light would go off after a certain amount of time. There's also provisions here that says you can't just have the occupancy sensor, you have to have a manual control to turn on off the lighting as well. So big changes in our lighting. Big changes for exhaust fan controls. The last large change here is that additional efficiency package that started in the 2021 code. Sorry. The 2021 said you're going to have an additional efficiency added in. 2024 says you can do as many different things as you want with prescriptive compliance, but you're going to have 2 measures minimum that you're going to pull. And you get at least 10 points for that. And doing that allowed them to roll back the insulation requirements. If it's a very large single family home, more than 5,000 square feet, then they have to do additional credits, and they all have to do at least 10 and 2 measures, but how many credits they get is actually based on what climate zone they're in. So let's see if I can get there. So the example we have here is just, it's this first group is looking at an equation that occurs as you're doing calculations for efficiency of the building. So that's an option, is to be more efficient. And notice in a cold climate zone, you get lots of points, whereas in a warmer zone, you don't get as many for that particular category. There's increases in insulation. There's better windows as far as their U factor goes. There's having the reflective material up on the roof so that heat is going to bounce back off and not all absorb into the house. Just lots of options. High efficiency appliances come into this table too. So there's many different things they can choose, and which one the builder and designer choose is completely up to them. Lastly, we have existing buildings, and there's a push. There has been a push for a while, but there's even more push now to bring into an existing building more energy efficiency. So as you touch something in the building, in this case, they're adding on an addition and torn off a wall as they add it in. So in the wall where that's been torn down, they're going to add insulation. In the new construction, they'll add insulation. And then they're also going to get 5 credits from that long list of different things they can do. Where somebody is doing an alteration of the building, then they only need 3 credits. And this is all where you're going into the walls or the roof, where there is an opportunity to do something, or you're changing out your mechanical equipment and you're going to a high efficiency furnace or a heat pump for your heating and cooling, perhaps. So many changes in energy. I've only covered a few. There are unfortunately many more, but it gives you a sense that this is the section that is changing most rapidly. Then lastly, the appendices.
Sandra, did you see this question?
Oh,
Yeah,
exhaust controls. Okay. So if there's an ERV or HRV taking moist air from the bathroom spaces, would that qualify? That's a good question. I haven't had that come up. It's not a control, but it's going to pull the moisture. So it wouldn't match the exhaust control, but it might replace it as an alternative that somebody could do. All right. Appendices, they got reorganized. And the ones you're going to care about most are going to be accessory dwelling units. So this is an existing house where somebody says, our zoning requirements have changed. We can now have 2 or 3 or 4 in some cities units on a given lot. So we're going to build, like in this case, an accessory dwelling unit above the garage, or we're going to divide up the house so there's multiple units. There's lots of different options for people in this, and it's an appendix, so it only applies where you happen to live in a jurisdiction or you're working in a jurisdiction where this has been allowed. There are currently 7 cities across the country now who have already put into their statutes new laws dealing with accessory dwelling units. For the rest of the country now, there's this appendix that they can adopt, and then people can make smaller dwelling units within a larger house or next to the larger house as an addition or on the same lot. Maximum size is 1,200 square feet, and it can't be more than half the size of the single family home. And that's after you cut up a single family home. So it limits it to a small dwelling. And then the other accessory, the other kind of weird appendix, if I can get it to go there, is extended plate wall construction. And this is allowing you to put more insulation there. So a 2x6 construction, 2x4 walls, you can put in continuous insulation and it fits inside the wall. So those two are appendices that you might see somebody do something about. There's a comment, takeaway from the meeting. Yeah, check out your snow lows. And construction details comply with the new requirements for party walls. Yep. Incorporate new requirements for the batteries. If that comes up, efficiency packages are going to be a big deal. So those are the things I want to make sure I talked about. Here's my contact information. If you don't have somebody at ICC to call, feel free to call me or email me. I try to respond to emails and phone calls within 24 hours. So typically I'm available and you'll hear back from me quickly.